Welcome back to another episode of Tuba People TV. Puddles and I are here in Seattle, Washington, in the studio of Gus Denhard. Gus, it's great to see you.
It's great to be here.
Gus and I were in Chicago together during the mid and late 80s. I ended up going down to Savannah, and you stayed on for several more years. And took over some of the work that I had and started your own, and were there till the early 90s and studied with Arnold Jacobs.
That's right, kind of a high point of my musical life.
Can you tell me what was the progression that led you to Jake's studio?
I was a tuba player in Baltimore, Maryland, freelance player, former student at Peabody Conservatory, and when Rex Martin came to town to fill in for a year, I was really inspired by the Chicago way of playing brass instruments. It was completely new to me and to most of my colleagues, and eventually, after David Fedderly got the job a year later, I was inspired to come out, and I would drive out on the weekends and study with Jake, and eventually more of my stuff was in Chicago than in Baltimore, so I moved there and I did the master's program and had really 7 years of really fertile musical education, like many of us who were just learning all the time, even when we didn't think we were.
Yeah. Do you remember, it's probably hard to remember your first lesson with Jake, or maybe not, but do you remember what was your first impressions of your time with him?
You know, it was just such a sensory experience being in his studio. I kind of felt like my tuba playing was two-dimensional going in and like three-dimensional coming out, because he would always find something. You'd go in, you'd play a phrase, you'd play 4 notes or something, and he would know exactly what that lesson was going to be about and what he was going to teach you. And I would leave with musical inspiration. I would leave with like a new physical connection to my instrument. And then I'd leave with like a sound concept that was like super vivid, you know, really clear in my head about what this instrument can sound like in my hands. And it was this sort of personal experience that I couldn't imagine anybody else would have the same experience that I did. But they did, you know. He would find something in your personality, in your abilities, and he would just run with it.
And was there anything that he did for you that you recall unique to his teaching, or that you took away from his teaching, whether it was some sort of pedagogical activity or just a way of thinking, or maybe both, really?
Yeah. Well, you know, a couple of things. He never said practice, but of course, when you'd come out of there with a concept like that, you realized, oh my gosh, I have to work this out for myself. I have to work this out. So, extreme commitment to discipline, even though he would never say, oh, you need to do this and you need to do that. You just knew it. You got this new idea and you just had to run with it because you had no choice after that, like, inspiring introduction. And so discipline was one thing. But then at the same time, this kind of freedom that he would inspire in people. You know, you can do this. Inspiration, freedom based on these new skills that you were developing. So, you know, put those two things together, it's hard to beat. You know, you're going to work, and you can do many things musically with these ideas. And in my case, it was like, didn't even just apply to the tuba, but to this other musical love that I have, plucked instruments from the Renaissance and Baroque period. And I found that the concepts were really very much the same. Get committed to an idea, get committed to a sound, you know, put your time in, express yourself loudly, and that's music, you know.
So it was really just finding the excellence, just finding the excellence in anything you're going to do. I remember that being a theme with him in my own lessons. Yeah.
Yeah, I can believe that. uh, he would spend some time with me, getting to the sound that I could make. It wasn't his sound, it wasn't your sound, but the sound that I could make with my body and my instrument. And then he'd show me what it was, and it'd be really vivid. It was always like a light bulb would go off when we got to that moment. And that's what he was looking for. And he wasn't looking for much more than that, because the rest of it's kind of up to me.
Yeah.
Once you got that spark, you can choose what to do with it.
What about, you were mentioning off camera, he had you doing maybe more than the average, Gus, of buzzing.
Oh, yeah. I was telling you. So I just had the weirdest embouchure, like 4/5 of my lower lip was vibrating.
Mm-hmm.
And so he didn't get concerned about that. He didn't say, oh, you got to move this, you got to move that, you got to develop other muscles. He just said, just buzz your mouthpiece all the time. And so it became kind of an obsession, like an addiction. It's probably like a safe addiction to have, but I'd be driving my car, just in the bathroom. There was a mouthpiece in every corner of the house. And I was just reinforcing this idea that we have to develop the nervous system to make music. And so I had a weird way of playing, but it worked, and he kind of just inspired me along that.
So the how you played didn't really bother him or get his attention so much as the motivation for your music making.
I think so. And while there may be one like physical type or set of physical attributes that would create great brass playing, there's like a wide range that would allow for really good brass playing. And so I think most of us fall in that category where we may not have everything physical that we would need in the ideal sense, but we have plenty and really all we need to make great music. And so he never wrote anybody off. You could be, you could have any set of talents or attributes when you walked into that studio, and he would give you the 100% to take it as far as it would go.
That's great. What do you think, Gus, what do you think drove Jake as a teacher? Because it strikes me he had so many different levels of people coming to see him. I mean, from the world's finest, some of the world's finest performers, all the way into people who were just doing community bands, and they all had they were all so happy to go study with him. What drove him?
Well, I think as we were talking, I think he's like the ultimate social animal. He loved people. He was interested in people. He had like empathy. If you had a problem with your music that was troubling to you, he would sense that and he would want to help. And so that kind of empathy and connection to people just made him extremely open to anybody who walked into his studio. I don't think he was evaluating any of us as to our potential. It was more like, oh, here's a really interesting person who is a musician. What can I do to further their goals? He was a party animal. If there was an event after a concert or workshop, he was there. He was the first in line for the beer and whatever else. So he loved being with people, the social aspect of it, I think. And what's really interesting is I think his approach not only affected the lessons that we took, but we were sort of part of a community in Chicago in the 80s that was very sort of self-supporting, like your willingness to give me work that helped my career. You got help from other players.
Right.
And we all behaved this way. We had colleagues that would make helpful suggestions. People would rehearse with you all night long on orchestral excerpts. And I think a lot of it came from his basic approach to how people can get along. Creating a sense of community. And out of that community, excellence is kind of like nurtured.
Yeah, it's funny. I hadn't. I think you're really the first person to bring that up. But you're exactly right. there was that sense of community, and he was. Remember, he would always during the lesson change, somebody was outgoing, somebody was incoming. It was always this. It wasn't just the current lesson would just jet out the door, and then the new guy would come in. There was always this period of change, and how are you doing? What's going on? If you didn't know the person coming in, he would always introduce you.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very community building environment. And the funny thing about it is, it was all done in his studio at the Fine Arts Building. We didn't have studio class, we didn't have tuba ensemble. He was never at Northwestern,
no,
except for the summer master classes.
Mm-hmm.
It was all done via the attitude that he brought to us at the Fine Arts Building.
Yeah, maybe it was a little, looking back, maybe it was a little old school, a little bit like manners from the previous generation, where you're just simply polite and open to everyone that comes along. Not that we don't have that today, but it was really in spades with him. And I'm not sure that every musical community has the same positive social connections and interactions that ours did at that time.
You think it's tuba specific?
You mean this approach? I don't think so.
Okay.
Like what I noticed among the wind and brass players
Yeah.
was, in general, there was this openness and connectedness. Anybody who had worked with Jake or knew his approach could sort of speak the same language, and that language was mostly one of openness and collegial approach. Seemed like.
I think you're right. It's something that I certainly try to emulate in my own studio. Get my students to be helpful with each other and pass on tips and work with each other. And I think it's a good vibe.
Yeah.
And I remember, actually thinking that it was a good vibe at the time. Now that you're bringing it up, and thinking that this probably wasn't happening at some other schools on the East Coast in particular, where it seemed like, from what I had heard, it was much more competitive and cutthroat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think we all knew it was competitive. At the moment when you would go in on audition, like we all auditioned repeatedly for the Civic Orchestra, and we would meet each other around the country at the one or two tuba auditions that would crop up that year.
Mm-hmm.
But it was not about cutting your friends in an audition. It was about how far can I take my own thing. And if you take your own thing far enough, you may be the person that's selected to do this job. But there's lots of other places to fall as a musician on fertile ground. And, all sorts of things you can do with your talent, with your inspiration. I think he sensed that, because he must have known that not all of us were going to be sitting in an orchestral chair for the rest of our lives. So we were prepared by that experience to do many things in music. I'm by day an arts administrator, and by night a professional performer on the lute family instruments. But it's the same kind of, for me, it was the same kind of inspiration. I can't wait to go to my office and make music happen. I can't wait to show up and play my other music on the lute family instruments. We learned how to be inspired.
Yeah. Back at the beginning of our segment, you had mentioned the listening to Rex and Fedderly with the Chicago way of playing a brass instrument. Can you be more specific and describe what that meant or means to you?
Yeah, I think I remember sitting in the concert hall at the time. I can't think of the name of it, in Baltimore. And I had sat there many times during rehearsals and before concerts and heard people walk out on stage, warm up, kind of greet the audience before the concert. And when those guys would walk out and play, there was like this extroverted nature, even to their first note that they played on stage. If it was a C major scale or something like that, it was, hey, here I am, this is my thing. And it was just a quality in the sound. It was like how they approached the instrument. When you heard it in the section, in the orchestra, was all this life kind of coming out. And with the tuba, you're not supposed to be the center of attention. You're not supposed to draw attention to yourself, really, except for a few key moments. But the tuba players, these guys, Rex and David, were inspiring a whole new approach to music by just sitting in that chair, you know. Not necessarily overt, but when they would play, there would be an infusion of like life and energy, you know, and we didn't have that before.
Yeah. So prior to their arrival on the scene in Baltimore, it was a much different sound.
I think it was a little bit more of like a workhorse thing, you know. We're here to do this job, and we know what our job is, and we do it very well. Nothing wrong with that at all. But to be able to do your job and then like express yourself and put in the right kind of energy for the music, and well, that's just such a different thing.
Yeah. Well, Gus, Puddles and I thank you so much for letting us come to your studio here in Seattle, and this is our second meeting in the last 25 years.
Guess so. We were lucky enough to cross paths due to a mutual
Eugene.
friend.
Yeah. So I really appreciate you taking the time, and Puddles has selected for you a matching set of University of Oregon reusable shopping bags for all your shopping needs.
I get 2 of them. Whoa!
I hope up here in Seattle these won't be too problematic for you out in the Fred Meyer.
I may turn them inside out when I go to certain parts of town.
Okay. All right. Great
Thanks,
to see
Mike.
you, Gus.
Okay.
And now back to you.
To the tuba.
So, where do you go to get a theorbo?
You special order it from a maker somewhere in the world, and they get it to you 5 or 6 years later.
Really?
Yeah. It's a waiting list. They're handmade kind of to order.
Wow.
It's problematic. Or you buy a used instrument when some player gets out of it or dies.
All right.
Yeah.
Are our heads in the shot?
Mm-hmm.
You getting all of his hair?
Well, he just... There we go.
Sorry.
I was telling Stephen that it's been 25 years, but all your hair is still there.
Other parts of me are falling off.
Oh.